Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I am Teresa Terze, Head of Marketing at Sinolytics, and I will be your moderator for this session. Thank you all for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you with us for the final session of our What the Tech briefing series. Today's session dives into the geopolitics of cyber and how this shifting landscape is reshaping risks and strategies for businesses around the world. Before we jump right into the topic, just a quick reminder, the session will be recorded and we will make the recording available to you afterwards, of course. I also want to encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar. The Q&A feature is activated for you, so just send the question in and we will make sure to address as many as we can at the end of our discussion. The question can also be handed in anonymously if this is important for you. Now, let me introduce our speakers and agenda for today's session. First of all, Björn Konrad, CEO of Sinolytics, will give his short introduction. Next, our three wonderful guests will discuss cyber geopolitics from their very individual points of view, and I would like to introduce them to you now. With us today is Nicholas Butts. He leads AI and cybersecurity policy at Microsoft. He brings deep expertise in tech and geopolitics with previous roles at Faculty AI and HP. He is also the co-author of the book Tech Cold War. A very warm welcome, Nick. It's great to have you with us. Vanessa Rugova is a senior analyst at Minerva Technology Futures, where she focuses on the geopolitical implications of AI and the global tech stack. Thank you so much for being here, Vanessa. Last but not least, let me introduce Mirjam Meissner to you. Mirjam is a managing partner at Sinolytics and a leading expert on China's digital regulation and tech policy. We are delighted that you are here, Mirjam. The last 15 minutes of the webinar will then be reserved for your questions. And with that said, I would like to hand it over to you, Björn.
Thanks, Teresa. And as always, thanks to all of you for finding your way to us. Delighted to have you and very much looking forward to this last installment of this webinar series. So we are nearing the end of this fantastic series that we have been presenting together with our wonderful partners from Minerva Technology Futures. And for all of you, and that's actually quite a number of you who have been with us all the way throughout this whole series, you know it has been quite the journey to many different places where geopolitics and technology meet and often clash, and where actually politics shapes and changes and often disrupts how technology around the globe works and develops. So I think it's very fitting that for this final installment, we basically go back to one of the most fundamental questions. It's actually the question that we started out with at the beginning of the series. So we are closing the circle with the question: how can companies, globally positioned, technology-based companies, deal with all of this, deal with the fallout of the end of the unipolar moment, and how can they do so sensibly, effectively? How can they deal with a tech stack that is splitting? Well, can they deal with a digital world that is fragmenting? And I think I could think of no better three people to actually answer that question for us, and that's why I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Hand over to Teresa and the panel and hear their insights. Thanks to all of you. Teresa.
Thank you, Björn. So let's jump right in. I think Björn made it already very clear. We are tackling key questions for companies operating globally, like how can they navigate rising cyber threats, regulatory uncertainty, and increasing geopolitical disruption. We are seeing growing talk of a fragmented digital world, with the US and China leading increasingly separate technological ecosystems. So what does that mean for geopolitics and for the global IT stack? Nick, you've been closely tracking these shifts. Are we heading for a total split into two competing IT spheres, like one Chinese and one US-led?
The very short answer is yes, absolutely. But let me maybe take a step back and explain a bit why. And first of all, thank you, Minerva. Thank you, Sinolytics, for inviting me. I'm very excited. I'm also very excited to be presenting the book that I co-authored with my close friend and Sinolytics affiliated Ansgar Baums on, who I know have been presented in a previous panel too. So I'm excited to be here. We wrote this book in part because we were two geopolitical nerds who found ourselves working for a tech company and thinking a lot about what the world would look like in 5, 10, 20 years. And all of a sudden, we were in this environment during the first Trump administration where things were being pulled apart. And I think from a technology perspective, we saw it first with the impacts on value change. Companies needed to adapt to tariffs, and that is very much something that the world, again, will have to do right now. And through this book, we analyze what we saw from a political perspective, but also what we saw from a technological perspective and a company perspective. And we essentially reached the conclusion that you outlined, Teresa, which is the world is indeed bifurcating in two. One distinct Chinese stack and one distinct US-led, quote unquote, Western stack. And I'll get back to sort of the sub-stacks that are beginning to emerge within that, in particular vis-a-vis Europe. But how we got here, essentially, it's not new that governments have tried to control technology. They have done that for millennia, partly because they recognize the economic and military power that it leads to. But when we saw the end of the Cold War, we saw this emergence and belief in Silicon Valley in particular that borders had fallen down, that digital technologies transcended states. And you saw global tech companies that exist even today being built out of this belief that they exist globally. And what you have seen in the last 20 years is a radical shift. It took around 28 years for 90% of internet access to be outside of North America. It's taken less than 3 for the same with AI. But AI and the leading AI companies are not in the market. That's more than 1.4 billion people in the world. That is the Chinese market. Neither OpenAI nor Anthropic are active there, as opposed to, for example, Google and Facebook, who at least partly both try to establish themselves there. And the reason why is simple. It's based on Chinese industrial policies. It's based on US export controls, which has created this tit-for-tat Cold War-esque dynamic where both countries view technological progress in either as a national security threat. And so here we are with two big sides. What does that mean for everyone in the middle? Now, most people sort of falsely believe that during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement of countries didn't really matter. That's really where all the action was. And so the same is true today. The countries like Singapore, like UAE, economic bloc like Europe, will have to essentially find its way. Our argument, though, is unlike some of the recent calls for an independent European IT stack, for example, we don't believe that it is feasible nor recommend it to have that. And essentially, companies will have to choose, do you build for either a US or a Chinese stack? If you try to do both, you risk spending twice as much money on R&D, twice as much money on value chains, twice as much money building the digital infrastructure that is completely separate and being outcompeted in both.
Thank you. And Miriam, like from a Chinese perspective, is this decoupling actually something China's actively driving, or is it simply responding to it?
No, it is definitely actively driving this, but it's more of a side effect, actually, of the Chinese government's core interests. And those core interests, I think 3 are most important here. And the first is national security, protecting national security. The second is sovereignty and political control, not only, but of course, but also of the digital space, and then industrial self-sufficiency and economic strength. So pushing for Chinese technology and Chinese industry to be self-sufficient. And then we are seeing the results in different shades of gray. First of all, China has protected the digital space from foreign investment and competition through various measures, including, for example, licensing requirements, subsidies, etc., all of this. And then this all allowed the large Chinese tech firms to flourish and also created favorable conditions for very innovative, very fast-paced startups in China. And many years ago, actually, this already laid the basis of a diverging Chinese digital ecosystem and IT stack. And then more recently, since 2017, since the cyber law was introduced, China's cyber and data regulations also put a strong focus on national security, actually, and further push towards a split IT and data stack. Since these regulations, they require data localization for certain types and volumes of data, high security standards, and certification for networks that could impact national security if they are being harmed, and also special protection and special requirements for anything, basically anything related to critical information infrastructure. And then lastly, China's push for self-sufficiency aims to promote Chinese solutions across the entire IT stack, including cloud software and also infrastructure, of course. And China seeks to be resilient and survive without any external technologies in the ideal case, so that it can survive even in the event of a military conflict, for example, or increasing geopolitical tensions. And at the same time, while China has been nurturing these Chinese alternatives in China on its home market, and developed a China-specific IT stack, it is also, of course, testing waters in global markets, examples including the digital Silk Road, but also the increasing presence of Chinese e-commerce platforms in Europe, for example. And I think actually for companies that operate globally, especially those with highly integrated globalized IT systems, IT setups, managing this divide is a significant challenge, and I expect this to become even more challenging in the years ahead, since now it's not only China pushing into that direction, but before already Biden administration, but now of course even more the new US administration is accelerating this trend. And to pick up on Nick's thoughts on the question, should companies play the Chinese IT stack, the US IT stack? They should, what I heard is they have to decide for cost considerations, actually looking into the IT architecture of companies, thinking about the software they use, thinking about the cloud, the storage systems they use. They often, especially if they act globally, they cannot decide, or if they want to keep global action in the Chinese market, but also be successful in the US market at the same time, they actually have to play both games in one way or the other. But coming back to your question, long story short, does China aim for an IT split? I wouldn't say they explicitly aim. China explicitly aims for it, but through its push for national security, digital sovereignty, and industrial self-sufficiency, China is creating the conditions for a parallel IT system, and is also prepared to exist within a kind of a Chinese intranet whenever necessary.
Now, Vanessa, let's bring in the US angle to this. I mean, is Washington intentionally pushing towards the split? And is Trump taking new or different approach compared to the Biden administration?
Yeah, so what I would say is the US from the first Trump administration through Biden and now back to this current Trump administration has definitely contributed to the IT split, the split of the IT stack. More out of concerns of obviously American competitiveness, but also national security concerns have played a key role in this as well. You know, Washington sees some degree of decoupling as necessary, especially in critical technologies that are tied to military advantage and, of course, cybersecurity. And so the goal is really to reduce the risk of cyber espionage and sabotage in some instances, particularly in communications and critical infrastructure. So what this looked like under the first Trump administration, a lot of the efforts were focused on cybersecurity threats, driving actions such as the Clean Initiative and the Rip and Replace campaign against Huawei and other Chinese tech due to cybersecurity concerns. We also saw during the first Trump term the creation of the Office of Information and Communications Technology Services under Commerce Department. So this essentially expanded U.S. authority to scrutinize connected imports, cars, drones, other IoT devices, out of concern that they could be used to halt or surveil vital systems. And so from the first Trump administration, we've seen a lot of those actions carried into the Biden administration. They continue and expanded many of these tools, but we're on the other end still trying to aim to minimize global supply chain disruptions. But what this looked like under the Biden administration, you had 2022, 2023 export controls limiting China's access to high performance chips. You also saw expanded ICTS reviews of Chinese tech that might compromise data infrastructure. And also interesting was during that time, new DOJ rules that restricted the sale of American sensitive data to adversary countries. And then also we saw sanctions put on executives from the Russian cybersecurity company Kaspersky in 2023, in addition to the US banning all of their antivirus software in the US based on national security concerns, both as a cybersecurity move, but also as a pressure tool amid the war in Ukraine. And so what you're seeing across both administrations is cyber intrusion risks have remained central, especially in the wake of current cyber threats that the U.S. is facing, emanating from China, specifically the Volt Typhoon campaign, which consisted of cyber threat actor burrowing into U.S. critical infrastructure, in potentially to position itself in cyber assets in event of a crisis and conflict with the US. And then separately, you also had the Salt Typhoon campaign, which was cyber espionage intrusion, which entailed gaining access to unprecedented amounts of extremely granular information from some of America's largest telecommunications companies. And so I would say this attack, especially coming into this current Trump administration, has accelerated this US urgency to build clean networks without the threat of foreign monitor. And will likely play a key role in essentially shaping how the Trump administration approaches cyber in the second term, and especially to how it sees the role of the IT stack. Now, looking ahead into this Trump administration, what can we expect? Well, from our view and from experts we've spoken to, likelihood there could be a further expansion of ICTS to cover more IoT threats, anything from drones to port cranes to routers. Continuing data flow restrictions to adversary countries and building on binary measures. While it still remains unclear about the current Trump administration's approach to cyber, as we still await a few Senate confirmations in key cyber roles, the ongoing conversation, both in Congress and from the Trump administration, has been, especially in the wake of Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, has been U.S. needs to do more in offense. The U.S. needs to be more aggressive in cyberspace. And so seeing how that will look, especially in terms of the fact that while we talk about, the growing concerns of especially Chinese intrusion of what we've seen recently, we can definitely expect the Trump administration to kind of continue on, cleaning networks and ensuring that critical infrastructure within the United States is as secure as possible.
So we're clearly in a moment of geopolitical realignment, but what does that actually mean for companies on the ground? I mean, Nick, turning back to you from your perspective, how are companies navigating this new reality where geopolitics is a daily operational issue and not this long-term concern it maybe used to be?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think there's the strategic and then there's the tactical. And so starting maybe with the tactical, to your point, when HP were going through how to think about supply chain and geopolitics given potential US tariffs, and I think many companies this will resonate with many companies today, given all the trade tensions. You sort of start with, how do we even navigate? And the more forward-looking companies have for a while already have some sort of geopolitical risk group in place, whether that's an external consultancy and support or whether that's an internal unit to think about it. When early in the book, we quote a study that EY did 2 years ago that looked at how many Fortune 500 CEOs make investment and strategic business decisions based on geopolitics. It went from very low to now more than 97%. So geopolitics is very much sort of like day-to-day driver of business decisions, whether that's part of your value chain or whether that's through HR and talent. The additional complicating factor have been that we use this frame in this phrase in the book where we talk about, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so for companies, they're increasingly part of the geopolitical struggle, in particular between US and China. So you've seen that with US activity and actions against very specific Chinese companies, Huawei, Tencent, TikTok, list goes on. And similarly in China, you've seen action against US companies with the unreliable entity list, actions against specific US primes who had sold defensive technology in Taiwan, but also even actions against specific Chinese tech companies in order to rein them in, Alibaba being sort of the prime example. So all of a sudden now you're operating in this company. It used to be focused on, we just care about doing business day to day. We watch geopolitics from afar, but we don't involve, to now you're essentially both a actor in an arena for geopolitics. And so companies are really fastly learning how to navigate. Now, a lot of this depends on where you sit. If you are a European industrials company, the way to approach this is very different from if you're a American headquartered global tech company like Microsoft, or if you are, and depending on how much presence you have in China. I will say that the challenge, and to Miriam's point in terms of global companies need to navigate both, that's what we argue in the book is ending. And that we argue that strategy will set you up for failure. And so just to give a couple of examples of that, you will see, particularly with digital, but you're already seeing it from a value chains perspective, large companies that used to have manufacturing capacity in China, it is not that they from one day to the next will end that and stop manufacturing in China, but all the forward-looking investment decisions are relocating out of China for geopolitical reasons. And the same thing has happened in digital. If you're a global company, because of US export controls, you cannot have US financial data or sensitive data interact in any way with any system inside of China. That complicates things if you run an e-commerce business, or if you have customers in China, or vice versa, you have a Chinese company who are selling to US customers, and if that does, those data cannot interact. You already have split cloud. You have requirements in China legally that requires either local cloud. Most companies host those in Singapore, but even those quote unquote safe havens are becoming increasingly difficult, because partly the development of technology, and particularly where AI is headed, you do require access to this data to essentially train models. And so how do you improve models if you can't access a huge part of your data sets? And companies essentially will be faced with this decision. And if they continue to try to straddle both, it is an option. The argument that we make in the book, though, is that you risk essentially not winning in either. And there's a couple of examples that have been quite public where a company like ARM essentially set up a separate entity inside of China. They tried to fire the CEO. The CEO refused to be fired and ran the company JV in China for another 2 years, even though the global board had essentially requested his tenure to end. Similarly, you see the challenges that TikTok is now facing, trying to set up separate data and governance structures to reassure American policymakers that it's not controlled, quote unquote, by the headquarters in China. And so for companies, this sort of tactical, disruptive day-to-day is happening on a daily basis, in particular now with value chains and tariffs, but it's just as importantly happening from a strategic perspective as part of board conversations. And so our argument is, for you to succeed, you really have to think carefully about how these dynamics play in. Even at a country level, if you look at a country like UAE, who for a long time have made have been very successful in navigating both quote unquote Western and Chinese and broader perspectives. They have had to make decisions specifically around technology where they've had to commit, and they have made commitments around access to US tech, and have made the trade-off that means that they no longer are able to acquire Chinese technology in the same way. And you'll see that the same at a smaller scale for companies. If you have a large e-commerce business in China, you will have a hard time also building a large successful e-commerce business in the US without at least having to invest in a duplicative structure And in doing so, you might get outcompeted in the US by the companies that only invest in that, and similarly in China. And, European, American companies, multinationals have known this for a while in China. That's not necessarily a new development. I think what is really new is, unfortunately, frankly, that we're seeing some of the same industrial policies that have been in place in a while for China take place in foothold outside of that, in particular North America. And so you had Vanessa and Miriam actually laid out quite nicely in both US and China, there's this striving for economic competitiveness balanced with striving for national security. And the rest of us seem to be caught a little bit in between. That doesn't mean you can't operate globally. It doesn't mean that you can't successfully navigate it. It will just become harder and more expensive.
Thank you for giving us a sense of just how much geopolitical fluency companies now need, especially as we also enter a new technological phase. I think this brings us to AI, the probably next major frontier, and one that's rapidly changing the game in cybersecurity as well. As AI evolves, so do the risks and also the tools. We are seeing both threat actors and also defenders turning to AI. So how exactly is this shift playing out in the cyber domain? Vanessa, how is US policy world approaching this nexus between AI and cyber, and what's top of mind for lawmakers and regulators at this time?
So I'd say there's three main dimensions to how the US is approaching AI in the cyber domain. You have, of course, the first is AI used by adversaries. Cyber threat actors have increasingly been harnessing AI to amplify the scale and sophistication of their attacks, deploying it to craft more convincing phishing campaigns, generate malicious code, and produce more realistic deepfakes. Malicious actors have also been utilizing AI to enhance cyber attacks and also targeting kind of the hype around AI. I believe just last week, Mandiant reported that there was a cyber crime campaign that exploited the popularity of AI tools by advertising fake AI video generator that was essentially embedded with malware designed to deceive users and compromise their systems. So that, of course, is always the concern is, how are our adversaries, how are malicious actors utilizing this to kind of get leverage in cyberspace? And then on the second round, there is a lot of conversation, I would say, and it's been an ongoing conversation both in the public sector and the private sector in the US in terms of AI for cyber defense. Traditionally, there's always been an imbalance between offense and defense in cyber. Attackers only really need to find one weakness to enter a system, while the defenders must protect everything. And so AI has been really critical in helping shift that balance a bit. This is especially urgent, especially since ransomware attacks are rising and the average time of intrusion to data exfiltration has dropped from 9 days in 2021 to just 1 day, while detection still takes around 6 days. And so AI is now really critical for defenders, especially since it's enabling real-time threat detection and response. From a policymaker point of view, US agencies like CISA, NSA, and the DoD are really investing in AI tools to help monitor anomalies and respond faster to these incidences. And then you also have the private sector really relying on AI and machine learning to filter alerts and automate responses. Again, one cybersecurity firm I was speaking to recently had told me that with the ability to utilize AI, they're able to detect nearly 9 million unique attacks daily in their US security operations centers. So again, I think on the defense route, AI has really helped the defenders understand what's going on in their systems and respond a lot quickly. And then on the final round too, I think when we talk about AI and cyber, there's also this issue of securing AI systems themselves. Obviously, as more organizations are deploying AI, the digital attack surface grows tremendously. And so that means AI systems themselves are becoming cybersecurity targets. And so what currently I would say the bigger conversation happening in DC, NIST is now trying to develop AI-specific cybersecurity overlays, so adapting its frameworks to guide industry on securing AI by design. We've had this conversation of security by design that CISA has been a proponent for a couple of years now in DC in terms of securing cybersecurity systems, now kind of bringing that over to how are we securing AI systems. And so there's definitely growing momentum among the public and private stakeholders to really implement as robust protections within AI systems as possible. And so overall, the focus is not only on, I would say, the growing role of AI in cybersecurity, but also cybersecurity in developing and deploying AI systems.
Yeah, let's return to China. How does the complexity of China's AI ecosystem create challenges for companies?
Yeah, AI is absolutely accelerating the developments that we are anyways seeing in China, or that we have been seeing in China since more than a decade, in terms of building up a very unique digital ecosystem. And what we are seeing now is that we are having a unique AI ecosystem in China. And so AI is also, from a company perspective, intensifying the situation of that there is no longer a one-size-fits-all approach possible, but a very unique China approach is needed if you want to stay ahead of the game in China. And meaning that AI applications that work in your home country will likely not work in China, and vice versa, due to different providers, of course, user preferences, regulatory requirements, and everything that we have also already mentioned in one way or the other. So AI is forcing firms into a local for local approach in China, and much faster than many have anticipated before. And I think this is extremely difficult for multinational European and US companies to navigate, not only because it's costly, of course, that's actually the first thing, but at the same time, many see their Chinese competitors moving quickly into China for China AI use cases, while they are themselves totally struggling to keep up with the fast-paced environment. And identify trustworthy partners is an issue. Understanding the regulatory limitations, getting access to the market is already quite the barrier. And then, of course, develop applications that meet the very specific Chinese demand. On a more positive note, you could also say that China is a great place to keep up to speed, or to train your speed, and to try and test AI use cases, because those Chinese AI use cases will certainly also move out of China to global markets sooner or later, given China's global ambitions for AI. And therefore, you could also argue that everyone should take advantage of this great training opportunity in China, while, of course, being aware of possible dependencies and decisions that you have to make between US and China, for example, and the necessity, of course, also to diversify risks. So yeah, in that sense, AI is a game changer for China business of companies. And at the same time, as also Vanessa nicely pointed out, also a catalyst for more broader cyber geopolitical trends.
Nick, from your position at Microsoft, how is AI changing the nature of cybersecurity, both in terms of threats and also how we respond to them?
Yeah, I love Vanessa's framing with those like three categories. So maybe if I try to replicate those on the first one, was offensive. So on the offensive side, just Microsoft obviously has a unique position in the ecosystem, right? So we actually defend ourselves and our customers against 600 million attacks per day. That's 7,000 attacks a second. So we already face an onslaught in cyber threats from sort of cyber criminal organizations and syndicates, your lone wolf hacker ransomware gangs, all the way through to very sophisticated nation state supported threat actors that pursue political, geopolitical espionage goals. At Microsoft, we track about 1,500 of those threat actors, and are seeing them leverage AI for the same things that everyone here are using them for, being more productive, doing research, writing better code. And so I think so far we have seen an increase in what we call TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures used by threat actors. So essentially enhanced capability and quote unquote effectiveness by cyber threat actors. We have yet to see, but are increasingly worried about more sophisticated threats. So using AI to augment malware. One of the things that is unique for AI, it is stochastic and probabilistic, meaning if you ask the same model, the same question twice, it may give you two different answers. That creates some challenges for security reasons, because a lot of our security systems today are based on predictive machine learning that takes a response depending on what it's learned. If you have malware that can be adapted real time using AI, that becomes really difficult to defend against. And so it is already an onslaught that has now been increased by the advent of AI. And there is downstream some concern that AI could potentially generate increased and more worrying threats. And just on that latter point, I will say, I get asked this question a lot, why aren't we seeing more of that sort of Stuxnet gone wild on AI? Frankly, the ROI is just too good on existing attacks. Unfortunately, there's so much work still to be done on basic cybersecurity, and too many companies, organizations, governments are too vulnerable. And so there's no need for threat actors yet to get very creative is the first part of the equation. The other is the really sophisticated ones that we are very worried about. They may be savoring it, and they have access to compute that will give them more power from an AI perspective, resources, and they have access to data that they can train the models on, both data that is publicly available that you can buy, but also data that they may have acquired through illicit means and espionage. And so this is sort of like a really essentially increased and fast evolving threat landscape. And to the other risk point that Vanessa raised in terms of then how do we secure these systems, companies like ourselves, Microsoft, have committed more than 80 billion to invest in supercompute data center infrastructure to support our AI buildup over the next year. Other companies have made significant investments too. That is a prime target for threat actors. And so there's how do we secure the infrastructure that supports this? That's commercially and economically a key interest, but also equally AI as a technology presents some very unique challenges from a software perspective that's different. 90% of securing an AI system is the same as securing any software, but there's some specific things. So one example of an attack vector for AI systems is prompt injection. So the indirect or cross prompt injection attacks are particularly prevalent for AI. So we're already seeing threat actors essentially creating fake GitHub repos online that then are used for open source models or proprietary source models to be trained on, that then has some poison data inside of it that potentially could be leveraged later by a threat actor. And the normal way that we do security for releasing a new product is you literally go by code. That becomes really difficult to do when we're talking about the scale of AI systems. And so companies like Microsoft, but also some of the AI labs that are developing these models, we're really thinking about this as a sort of potential security vector and what are additional steps that we can take. The upside is, and I think Vanessa laid it out very well, is there is an opportunity to get really sophisticated tools in the hands of defenders, offsetting the balance that currently exists that benefits attackers. I think for AI specifically, again, similar to like our day-to-day work, if you're using Copilot to summarize emails or draft up a report or enhance your code writing with GitHub, we have efficiency tools for security teams. One of the biggest challenges for cybersecurity is actually talent and capacity, in particular for critical infrastructure operations that may not have a lot of resources. And so for them to be able to offset that with using AI tools is a huge game changer. But similarly, also in more specific sort of tactical security operations, there's a lot of benefits that AI tooling can provide. And obviously, Microsoft as a company, we are making a huge bet on this specifically with our product portfolio with both Security Copilot and across our security stack. So across all three, there's sort of changes happening. On balance, I'm a glass half full kind of guy. And so for me, hopefully, there's a finite number of threat actors. There's always going to be bad actors trying to do bad things. I do think the implications of this technology does provide an opportunity if we can get it into the hands of the defender to improve, but it's still a challenge. And we haven't even talked about the new buzzword in AI, which is agents. And so agentic AI is going to, again, change security challenges the same. Not only do you need an AI tool to be able to do what we call tool calling, that is either speak to a URL or an API to, for example, take action autonomously, that provides a security risk. But in a not so distant future, you're going to have infinite number of AI agents that will communicate with each other from different organizations with different security structures, with different data accesses. How do you make sure that that communication happens flawlessly and securely? Very similar to the dawn of the internet with HTTP protocols, DNS protocols. How do we make sure that that can happen securely? Is challenging in itself from a technology perspective. Now insert the geopolitical reality that we've talked about, where you have split stack, where data cannot flow freely. That becomes really difficult from a company organizational perspective to think through what that means for their structure if they think, you know, more than 12 months out. So a huge challenge, very interesting. Hopefully on balance, AI will create more benefits for defenders, but certainly increased an evolving threat landscape.
So while the tech landscape is evolving fast, the geopolitical dimensions aren't standing still either, especially here in Europe. The EU is increasingly trying to find its own path between dependency, sovereignty, also between global cooperation and strategic autonomy. So what role can Europe play in this fragmented cyber geopolitical environment? Miriam, what steps is the EU taking to position itself in this game?
Well, I mean, we are seeing a lot of initiatives coming up, of course, support for here and there independency in terms of IT stack, regulations for network security, for critical infrastructure security, for the AI Act is also, of course, an important example. Ideally, I would say the EU has its own independent IT stack, and so let's build up on it and make use of it. But that's not the case, and it would also be incredibly costly to develop, of course. However, I mean, the EU is, I think, sometimes the tendency is towards complaining about the situation and then jumping into even stricter regulations. But I think it would be a good exercise for the EU actually to put some thoughts into existing strengths and that it can build upon and also nurture strategically. This relates, of course, to the already excellent industrial capabilities, like also key niche players such as ASML, etc., but also innovation capacity that the EU certainly has. And I would like to highlight actually two aspects that I would think could be beneficial for the EU to work on. Firstly, there is it's certainly unrealistic to achieve full independency from China and the US. That's very clear. But I think it's important for the EU to define a very clear and pragmatic strategy that aims for strategic autonomy in some areas, in some cases, or at least a risk diffusion wherever possible in selected areas, while accepting strong dependencies in less critical areas where you could say, yeah, it's fine. It's not as critical for us in a worst case scenario. And in this regard, the EU is actually in principle on the right track with NIS2, for example, AI Act, etc., what I already mentioned. But what I think actually it could borrow some more of China's strategic planning mindset when it comes to pragmatically protecting its digital core. That would be something that I would love to see, actually. And secondly, I believe the EU is actually facing a significant opportunity right now that is funnily rooted in the current geopolitical situation and the situation in both countries, US and China, on both sides, which it should actually use wisely because talent is looking out to the EU, and many well-educated people in the US are now targeting Europe as an interesting area for settling down, for moving, for doing research in a less contested or less difficult environment. And this is something, if Europe is successful in using that possible wave of talent moving to Europe, from the US, as I mentioned, but also on the other side from China, because well-educated Chinese are very interested actually in coming to Europe if the conditions are right. So this is certainly something where the EU could position itself as a kind of a safe haven within the current geopolitical context, and with excellent conditions for innovation and startups. Who knows? Maybe then the next generation IT will be dominated by European companies. That would be great. And I mean, I know there's many barriers, including regulations, of course, slow-moving bureaucracy, difficult political tendencies in many European countries, etc. The list is long, but I think in this current geopolitical context, it's also important to think ahead optimistically sometimes and start designing a fruitful basis for a positive future that could turn current geopolitical uncertainty into a competitive advantage. And Europe may not dominate the current IT stack, that's for sure, but it can certainly shape the next one if we find the right balance of resilience, regulation, openness, and also innovation power.
From a transatlantic perspective, how might EU-US cooperation on cyber evolve in the second Trump term?
So, I mean, listen, I think when we talk about cybersecurity and international cooperation, especially between the EU and US, it's critical in any space other than. And so, you know, we saw even under the Biden administration, international cooperation was one of its core pillars in the cyber strategy. We had the State Department also have its international cyberspace and digital policy strategy really emphasize digital solidarity with allies. Transatlantic cooperation really included significantly a lot of progress through the EU-US Trade and Tech Council, which was established by the US and EU in alignment on very key areas, just software security, incident reporting, supply chain resilience, and then also intelligence sharing. And then we also saw a lot of collaboration between CISA and NISA on best practices and support of Europe's NIS2 directive, but also on regulatory harmonization to allow, you know, the transfer, especially of data across borders, especially for the business sake and cybersecurity purposes. And, you know, one thing that I keep focusing on even in this current climate is, you know, in 2023, a major milestone was the EU-US data privacy framework, which of course restored grounds for transatlantic data flows after Schrems 2. And so this framework really plays a key role in cyber data security flows and the support of cross-border threat detection and response. And so obviously we're so early on into this current Trump administration. So on the cyber realm, we haven't seen yet how cooperation will look internationally. There is, in terms of one thing I've been on the lookout, Trump had recently fired 3 Democrats off the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. And the issue with this is without at least 3 member quorum, this oversight board can't start new projects or issue any official board reports, such as its review of the EU-US data privacy framework and government surveillance programs. And so this is a huge risk because this board is essential for EU trust and US surveillance oversight. And without it, the adequacy decision behind the data privacy framework is at risk, really threatening the legal basis for data transfers, including via standard contractual clauses. And so what this can lead to is more difficulty in cross-border data flows, especially of security data. And, you know, when we think of the threat, I appreciate how Nikisha Arora, CEO of Palo Alto Networks, cybersecurity firm, puts it in terms of cybersecurity is a data problem, essentially. So when you end up fragmenting data flows, you make it harder to train AI systems, detect global threats, weakening both sides while, again, empowering adversaries. They are empowered by fractured and siloed systems, especially when we're not cooperating. So looking ahead in this current Trump administration, obviously there's concerns about renewed policy volatility and erosion in trust in U.S. data protections. Again, I think this is very much helping drive greater digital sovereignty conversations in Europe and stricter data localization laws. That would mean, again, a more fractured transatlantic digital ecosystem at a time where, you know, we need to be cooperating more on this front rather than working apart. But where I do have some optimism, because I always would like to end in optimism, you know, cybersecurity remains a shared nonpartisan priority, especially in the US, and cooperation here, I believe, really can endure amid broader political tensions. International collaboration at the end of the day with partners is critical in cyber. The Trump administration, even the first term, understood that. But, you know, in this administration, just following what certain folks in the Trump administration are saying. You know, you had Secretary Rubio recently put out, you know, America first does not mean America alone. And so from what I take from that is that there is still going to be a push. Currently at the working level, it's still business as usual, especially as we're working with partners in certain aspects like threat intelligence sharing. So what that looks like is still hard to say, but overall, I do believe that the Trump administration does have a priority in cyber and will still look to ways to continue that type of collaboration with Europe.
We are running out of time a bit, but still I'm quite confident to ask a couple more questions just about how we can now move from politics more into practice and talk a little bit about what this all means now for companies trying to stay resilient in the face of this growing complexity. So far, we've heard a lot of about the structural trends, but what can companies actually do to build this resilience at the intersection of cyber, AI, and geopolitics? And Nick, to you, what are you seeing at Microsoft in terms of practical strategies companies are using to prepare for AI-driven cyber threats?
Yeah, so maybe just to say, Microsoft obviously takes a number of steps, but Microsoft being the largest market cap company in the world also have resources that maybe not is available to all companies. So let me also provide some practical guidance. I'm an advisor to like a number of AI startups. I've worked in startups before. I've worked in government. So I think whether you sit in a large organization like Microsoft or in government, or whether you're in a small startup and thinking about this, step one is recognize that this is happening. So the trade tensions between China and the US have now transcended, I would argue, for US administrations. Even following this current administration, it will continue. What does that mean for your business if you have footprint in either, or if you're reliant on value chains that run through either? And if they are increasingly becoming bifurcated, what does that mean for you as an organization? What does it mean for you if you're digital first, or if you have digital relevance for you, if those data pools, though the ability from a digital infrastructure perspective to be able to operate across both smoothly becomes more challenging or more costly? What does it mean for your organization? And then I think also, and most critically, think ahead. I think the most successful companies I have seen are not just in reactive mode, reacting to the next announcement on Truth Social or Twitter, but are planning ahead, aligning what they see geopolitical trends developing as, and intersecting that with their company perspective and reality, as well as the company business, commercial development strategies that they are trying to drive. If you can reach that intersection, that's when you'll really be set up for success. And I will say, obviously there's a number of folks on this call that does provide this. I would just encourage you to also seek external advice and guidance. I think what some of the most successful projects I have been part of that navigate this have been where you have very strong internal teams that have strong mandates to provide guidance to executive decision making, supported by independent thinking, whether that's other teams in the organization or whether that's outside of the organization. And so I would just encourage everyone to just recognize that statement. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu, start planning ahead. Even if you think geopolitics doesn't matter to you, I will tell you, states and geopolitics itself certainly disagrees, and they will come for your company. And the ones that succeed, they're ones that plan ahead.
Thank you. Now, very brief, and I encourage you, if you have questions, ask them now. Miriam, from your point of view, what are key steps, very roughly, you walk through with clients aiming to strengthen their IT resilience, especially when dealing with China-specific risks?
Yeah, absolutely. I will try to keep this very short. So first of all, I think it is important to, on top of what Nick already mentioned, it is important for companies to recognize that their IT architecture, their IT infrastructure, all of it related to it, also product IT, for example, is not purely an IT issue, but a strategic area that will be essential for survival during periods of geopolitical instability. And I think this is something that is not in the minds of everyone yet, unfortunately. And at the same time, also a very important baseline is that this has to be treated, based on my experience with our clients, on board level, because it requires orchestrated action. And orchestrated action meaning it combines very different corporate functions that would usually not work together. And they are all needed during the process. That includes IT, of course, but also legal, supply chain, government affairs, sometimes even product development and R&D, etc. And therefore, a cross-functional geopolitical tech task, or however you want to call it, is absolutely essential. And then in our projects, we move to different steps that may seem obvious, but I can tell you it's not always obvious. Based on experience. So first of all, a mapping is needed of a company's IT setup, including software, hardware, of course, infrastructure, but also data storage, data flows, etc., and digital supply chain. So of course, also a very important element in this. And then in a second step, we usually do a mapping of strategic vulnerabilities, identifying critical geopolitical dependencies and their potential impact on the company in the event of disruption. And this usually includes a mapping or a mapping of the current situation, but also a stress testing of the company's IT setup under certain geopolitical scenarios or risk cases, such as what would happen if my US cloud provider could no longer provide services in China, just to pick an example. And then in a third step, this must of course be followed by a strategic decision-making process, deciding on reasonable and necessary action to become more resilient across the board. Anything that you could think of: data localization, local for local setup, yes or no, vendor diversification, yes, all kind of things that the list is long that I have here, but I keep it at that, looking at the time. And last but not least, all of this can only be sustainable if you continuously review and fine-tune in a regular manner with simulation, scenario planning, etc., because this needs to be kept alive to make you really resilient, not just in this very moment, but also going ahead. So yeah, that would be usually the steps that we follow through within our project.
Thank you for laying this out. And thank you, the three of you, for this amazing input. Yes, we ran out of time a bit, but on the other hand, I think it was definitely worth going through all those questions, as I think this was really interesting input for us. Thank you again. Time is up. So yes, if you would like to explore this topic further, I would highly recommend to read the book co-authored by Nick, I mentioned earlier. It is called Tech Cold War, and the QR code basically guides you to the website for further information about content, authors, and so on. So thanks again very much for joining our What the Tech series. And if you have any follow-up questions you were, sorry again, not able to ask in today's round, please don't hesitate and reach out to us directly. We're always happy to get in touch and have follow-up conversations. Have a great day or evening ahead, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Teresa. Thanks, everyone.